Good afternoon, everyone. The governor just presented the executive budget. I think everyone should have it, and it's posted on the website right now. I am going to go through the financing plan and talk through how both the investments and how we finance it as a follow-up to the governor's presentation. It's helpful to start where we were a year ago, last January. Last January, the state was looking at a revenue shortfall of $39 billion over a 4-year period. We had the blue line here is the pre-pandemic projection, and then the yellow line was the projection post-pandemic or in the middle of the pandemic. This was largely resulting from the economic impacts of the government, of the shutdowns, and also the surges that were actually happening in January of last year. So in January, what we faced was we had uncertainty. Federal funding was uncertain. When we put out the executive budget last year, vaccinations had started, but the question was, would they actually work? Would they be enough? Restrictions were in place both in New York State and across the country, and that obviously impacted economic activity, not just in New York, but all across the country. And then COVID cases, again, were surging nationally. Today, we find ourselves in a very different place, January of 22. COVID cases are surging, but as the governor's been talking about, we're starting to see meaningful declines. Pandemic restrictions also are significantly reduced from what they were, and their impact on economic activity is significantly decreased. On the funding side, billions of dollars in federal aid has materialized and has started to move. We now know that the vaccinations are abundant. People now have first, second, and third shots. And we know that the vaccinations are working to decrease the severity of COVID-19. So that's also helped the economy move forward and come back from where it was in January of last year. State revenues are also recovering far faster than anticipated. This is a national trend. But in New York, because of the impact of the financial sector, we're seeing it probably a little bit more profoundly. But we also saw a bigger decline than in other parts of the country. But we're in a strong financial position now as a result of the increase in strong tax receipts, a very strong stock market, and the federal aid from the pandemic, all of which were unanticipated in January of last year. There are still risks, but we start off in well-positioned from a budgetary perspective. The economic outlook, real U.S. GDP surpassed its pre-recession peak. So we were talking about whether or not there was a lot of talk whether there was going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped recovery, and depending on, there's obviously an uneven recovery, which we'll talk about. But overall, GDP was very strong and grew past its pre-pandemic position after contracting 3.4% in 2020. The federal fiscal stimulus went out, it helped, but it's starting to diminish over the course of 2021. So this also helped GDP growth, both in New York and nationally. But again, that stimulus is declining, and we are seeing that also, that impact of that. It also impacted inflation, which we'll talk about. We have labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, energy prices that are growing. So these are all additional risks that are impacting our plan. And the fiscal stimulus has contributed to CPI growth of 4.7%. And this is the highest rate of inflation that we've seen in 30 years, since 1991. As of November, New York's economy has gained 62.6% of the private sector jobs lost in March and April of 2020. New York State's employment is projected to grow by 4.5% in 23, and private sector growth is expected to grow by 5%. State wage growth actually fell in 2021, right? But New York State wage growth is projected to increase by 11.4% in 2022, and that's mostly due to strong bonus payments and a rebound from the unemployment losses in the prior year. The fiscal stimulus, again, is starting to wane, right? And we expect that there will be interest rate hikes in 2022. So we have modest growth in 22 of 1% and 1.1% for personal income. But that's coming off of right, large increases this year. So if you look at just real U.S. GDP growth and unemployment rate, you see the dramatic decline that occurred, and you also then see the recovery. This chart shows both U.S. GDP and the unemployment rates. So both of them, the unemployment rate dropped dramatically, but then you can see it just as dramatically is recovering, and GDP growth, again, is surpassing where it was pre-pandemic. CPI, also we're seeing the highest levels of inflation, again, in 30 years. We expect that to wane off as we get into 23, and that is largely the result of the end of the spending, the stimulus spending, the recovery spending from the federal government. The percent change in employment, we had seen very significant decreases in employment in New York State. New York State suffered more than the rest of the country, largely because of it started here, and then also the result of the density of the cities. And cities across the nation saw similar impacts of COVID. We are now recovering in jobs, but New York is lagging the rest of the country. And it's actually two parts to it, New York City versus compared to the rest of the state. If you look at the rest of the state outside New York City, the job recovery is tracking more closely to the rest of the nation, while New York City's employment recovery is lagging. And it's lagging mostly in the lower wage sectors, service industry, travel, and tourism. So if you look at employment related to 2019, right, we'll see 20, 21, and 22 are plotted on this table. You can see the recovery in jobs in 22, right, in most industries. But if you look at leisure, hospitality, and other services, which are almost on the bottom of this table, you'll see they were impacted the most, nearly 30% job losses, and they are recovering the slowest. So the impact, and that sector is important to across the state, but in the downstate region particularly, so we're watching those. This is in contrast to the wage growth we're seeing, and that's largely because the wage growth is directly related to the financial sector and parts of the economy that did not, while people were impacted in their offices, they were able to work from home. Sectors where you had to show up and face-to-face, those areas suffered the most. So here's the unemployment rates plotted again, and you can see it peaked, New York State and U.S. Both New York State and the U.S. are seeing sharp declines in unemployment, which are starting to decline at a slower rate. And again, the New York's blue line here is still higher than the rest of the nation, but that is largely because of the anchor of New York City right now in terms of unemployment, not in terms of wages. So New York State income and the employment outlook here, again, we are showing a recovery, both in employment, personal income, and wages, returning to more of a normal period of growth as it was in the pre-pandemic period. And again, there are risks associated with these forecasts. But as you can see, most of the other sectors, we're projecting growth in almost every sector actually, even travel and tourism, but we're seeing a lot of growth in the finance and insurance industry. New York's was more dependent on finance and insurance industry sectors or fire sectors over the last 10 years. Our revenues have diversified significantly, so we're not as dependent on that sector. However, the financial sector is driving a lot of the growth. So we go to the 2023 financial plan overall. So in the mid-year financial plan update, the governor set aside 15%, or started to set aside 15% of spending in reserves. The idea was the recovery is uncertain, how we're recovering from the pandemic is uncertain, and the level of revenue growth is unprecedented, and the state's reserves were lacking. So the intent in the financial plan was to begin saving money and putting money into reserves so we're better prepared for future risks. You all recall when the pandemic hit, we did not have enough reserves, obviously, to make it through the pandemic. So if it wasn't for the federal funds, we would have had to do reductions of up to 20% last year. I think the executive budget last year showed reductions of up to 20%. Once we got the federal funds, we were able to remove those cuts. If we had reserves, then we would be able to have done the same thing in the absence of federal funds. As a result of the revenue increases, we are putting 15% in reserves, and we're able to eliminate our out-year gaps. So in the mid-year, and again, in this executive budget, this will be the first time that the Division of Budget has published a financial plan in New York State with 0 out-year gaps. So there'll be no out-year gaps in the plan period. We are also adding 26 and 27 to the financial plan to also show that there are no gaps as far out as 2027. And that's just to demonstrate that as the federal funds fall off, we still have no out-year gaps, even without the federal funds. And we spread out the federal funds over multiple years to avoid a fiscal cliff. Since the time of the mid-year, we've had more forecast revisions, and again, revenues have climbed even further. So tax receipts are expected to close in the current year about close to $4.9 billion above even the mid-year forecast. So the mid-year assumed planned deposits into reserves. Now the receipts forecast is about $4.9 billion higher than that. So I'll go through how we spend that additional $4.9 billion. Also, spending has decreased, and the spending in school aid claims as a result of schools not being open all the time, so some of the expense-based claims have been reduced. The stock market has contributed to the pension spending for the state going down and local governments. Debt service, we've seen better rates. So, and we've used some of the coronavirus relief funds to offset states' payroll expenses. So one of the eligible uses of the coronavirus relief funds is police and other payroll expenses. So we use that. The CRF funds had to be committed by December 31st of 21. So we fully committed the $5.1 billion in the CRF. So baseline projections, again, are showing surpluses of $5 billion in the current year, 6.4 in 23, 5.3 in 24, and 5.5 in 25. And then we'll show in this plan what we do with those surpluses. And again, that is after we make the deposits to the reserve funds to get to the 15% state operating funds reserve target by 2025. So the surplus position in combination with the reserve deposits already planned makes it possible in this year's budget to really fund new commitments, make investments, right, to address some of the unique problems associated with the recovery from the pandemic or exacerbated by COVID-19, and at the same time, doing it responsibly. Again, we'll make those investments, which we'll talk about, while making deposits in the reserve funds to get to 15% and having 0 out-year gaps, which again, we've never had before. Overall, the executive budget of an all-funds basis will be $216 billion. And if you can see where it goes, about 60% of it goes to healthcare, education. This is on an all-funds basis, and the reason the healthcare is higher than education on all-funds basis is because the federal funds related to Medicaid, and education does not have that level of federal funds. When you look at state operating funds, which is taxpayer dollars and other special revenue funds, then you'll see Medicaid at about 25%, school aid at about 26%, so almost even between the two. And again, that's half of the budget. So half of our state operating funds budget is Medicaid and education. When you look at the all funds includes federal funds and includes capital, which is not in the state funds, state operating funds numbers. So the all funds for 22, we project it's going to close this year at about $212.9 billion. And then the growth rate in the governor's executive budget to last year on an all funds basis will be about 1.6%. The reason it's low is because a lot of the federal funds fall off, because again, on an all funds basis, you're counting federal funds. So the federal funds fall off, and that shows 1.6% increase. On a state operating funds basis, we're looking at a $3.6 billion increase, $118.8 billion. And again, that's a 3.1% increase, which is below the projected rate of inflation for 23. That's driven by what's driving the increases: school aid, 7.1% increase in school aid, or $2.1 billion. And that is the second year of a commitment to fully fund foundation aid. Last year, the investment was close to $3 billion. This year, it's 2.1. Foundation aid portion of that is about 1.4. And this is purely formula driven. So we're taking the foundation aid formula, we're fully funding it, which was the commitment, and that has school aid growing at 7.1%. On the Medicaid side, there's a lot of investments that we're making in the Medicaid space and in the healthcare space overall, and that's largely trying to deal with the impacts on the healthcare industry as a result of COVID-19, and hospitals, nursing home, home care, and the workers have all been impacted dramatically. And the governor's very focused on making sure that that healthcare system not only recovers, but we're prepared for the next pandemic, because obviously there was not lack of preparation, although probably no one was, but lessons learned here, where we're going to make the investment now for the future. Agency operations growing by 1.2%. We do make targeted investments in both personnel and also wage investments in the current workforce. The decline is largely a result of a decline in workforce that you're seeing everywhere. The state is not immune to that. So overall, the financial plan overview, right? The executive budget provides for balanced operations in every year through 2027. So again, there are no gaps through the entire plan period, and we add an extra year just to demonstrate that there isn't a fiscal cliff associated with the fall off of the federal funds. Spending growth is 3.1% in 23, which is below the rate of inflation, which I believe is about 3.3. The out year growth is driven by school aid and Medicaid, and at the same time, all of these commitments are sustainable over the plan period, and with the current year surplus of $5 billion, largely used to fund one-time expenses. So we did not want to ramp up spending based on surpluses that then recur, and then you're not able to make those investments later. So where does the surplus go? We make, in this budget, there are about $7 billion in proposed actions that are not permanent spending, so they're one-time costs. They don't contribute to out-year gaps, but they're critically important. $2.2 billion for property tax relief. That's taking some of the surplus, giving it back to 2 million New Yorkers. This $2 billion will be set aside for pandemic recovery initiatives. The goal of that is to work with the legislature and identify what are the most targeted investments that we need to make, but we set that aside for one-time pandemic recovery initiatives. $1 billion goes to the new 5-year capital plan. So we have a 5-year capital plan for highways and bridges. It's across the state. It's $32.8 billion, and we put some hard dollar funding in there, which the governor mentioned in her speech this morning. $1 billion for healthcare transformation. We're also setting aside $1 billion in a reserve for transformation for the healthcare industry. Again, we're learning lessons every day in the healthcare side, and we wanted to set that money aside, so also to work with the legislature and identify the priorities for healthcare and transformation. $1 billion goes for bonuses for healthcare and frontline workers. That number is actually larger, closer to $2 or $3 billion when we add in federal support for those numbers. So there is some match and some federal resources that we have identified as well that will also go to bonuses for direct care, frontline healthcare workers who are still dealing with the pandemic as we speak across the state. And then $350 million is for pandemic relief for businesses and some of the travel, some of the Broadway, music industry, those kinds of parts of the sector that have been impacted most severely. They were starting to recover before Omicron, and then as you have all seen, a lot of these performance venues had to shut down again, and those venues are critical for the economy, particularly in the downstate region. So while we're making, again, all of these investments, at the same time, we're still making the deposits to reserves, and we still have a balanced plan. The spending growth, we talked about this. This is where it's going. You see school aid is at 7.1. The number for Medicaid, that is just the Medicaid cap number of 4.7%, because we increased the global cap to 4.7. Actual spending in Medicaid, all in, is actually over 6%. So school aid is 7.1% as a result of the funding the foundation aid, and Medicaid is actually over 6%, which is not reflected here. And you can see overall we're at 3.1, and inflation is 3.2. The financial plan overview, this is the base budget surplus. So these are the revisions to the financial plan, which show $6.4 billion increase in 23, followed by 5.3 in 24, followed by 5. So these are the receipt forecasts that we're seeing this year, how it follows through to each one of those years. So this enables us to both make the investments while also making the deposits to the reserve funds. So then we talked about these, but we have the homeowner tax rebate credit, middle class tax cut acceleration. There was a middle class tax cut that was supposed to be phased in. We're accelerating that to 23 so that people can just get that faster. The small business tax relief, there's the healthcare frontline worker bonuses, which we discussed. There's a COLA 5.4% for all the human services agencies. Higher education, which fund new operating aid for both SUNY and CUNY, and then mental hygiene. And then there's other, again, PAYGO capital and other items. But as you can see, the important line here is you start off with those surplus numbers on top, and we end up with zeros on the bottom, and that's fully funding all of the spending through the years and the gaps. This is the out-year gaps. This is the history. We can take that first bar and go back as long as you want. There are always gaps. This is a roll-up of the 3-year gaps. So after when we present every executive budget, we also present the gaps for the next 3 years. So those are the 3 colors that you're seeing there, right? So those are the following 3-year gaps. So if you look at 2010, during the executive budget in 2010, there were out-year gaps of $24.7 billion over the next 3 years. And then those are the gaps from 2010, again, through 21, as you can see. In 22, after we got the federal money, it was $3.4 billion. And then from 23, 24, 25, 26, and 27, we have 0 out-year gaps. Federal relief. We took the federal relief, and it's a direct financial plan benefit for us. It came in 3 forms. This FEMA aid is just still coming in. And we've spent all of the CRF. Again, that's the yellow here. And that had to be spent by December 31st of the current year. We received $12.75 billion in 21, and we're using that over 4 years. Again, we have resources to make investments, and we spread it out over 4 years to avoid a fiscal cliff and to make sure that what we're seeing on the revenue side holds up over that plan period, and we're doing it. But we're not sacrificing investments, and I think you can see that in all of the spending that is in this budget. The remainder of the 5.1 fund had to be spent by December 31st, and then we use 2023. We have $2 billion reserve in 23, $2.25 in 24, and then 3.6 in 25. And again, we go out in our financial plan to 26 and 27 to just show that even when those fall off, we still have a balanced plan. $12.75 billion was the amount in revenue shortfall that we received from the American Rescue Plan. We've calculated a revenue loss for the period of $9.9 billion. We're waiting for the federal government to approve that calculation and methodology. In the event that that's not approved, we will find other places to spend that money. But the aid can be used to support pandemic response efforts, lost state revenue, which was our main issue at the time, aid households, small businesses, industries, essential workers, and communities disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, water and sewer, and broadband, all of the things that we are doing in this budget. So we are funding in every single one of those areas. And this money is in hand, but it's not guaranteed yet until the feds approve our calculation. So the fiscal crisis and reserves, right? Since 2000, state finances have been badly damaged 3 times by sudden events. We've had 9/11, we've had the Great Recession, we've had COVID, and none of these events were predictable. And what we know for sure, right, is they will happen again. Something will happen, it has. And every time there's been shocks to the system, and every time from a budgetary perspective, from the state's perspective, our ability to respond is directly related to what funding that we have. Each time the state has found itself unprepared, inadequate reserves, and the outcome was that we had to cut or go back on promises or commitments that were made, and they've been deferred. The best or real-world example was in 2008. There was a state commitment to fund foundation aid for school aid. We had no money set aside during that time. We hit a recession, and that commitment lasted just 2 years. And then starting in FY10, the state had the recession, and then we had to not only freeze foundation, but we had to make reductions in school aid. We did not come back to that level of school aid spending, or we could not fully fund foundation aid again until 2022. So it took from 2008 to 2022 before we recovered. The point here is that if we're going to make these investments, make them with allocating reserves so that in the event that you have some of these shocks to the system, we won't have a repeat performance in the same crisis. The state will be prepared. Reserves are the best defense for repeat performance. At Governor Hochul's direction, in the mid-year budget, we started the plan to put reserves aside by 15%, and this budget fulfills that commitment with a reserves deposit of close to $5 billion in the current year and each year until we hit 15% of state operations spending. And again, there are no gaps in the out year when we're doing that. Experts across from the Government Financial Officers Association, Center for Budget Policy Priorities, all recommend for any size of government having 15% in reserve in order to avoid cuts, right, at a time of an economic downturn. The federal government doesn't have to keep money in reserve because it's an economic downturn. They print money. We can't, and the state is forced to. The executive budget must be presented as a balanced budget each year, so we cannot deficit spend. So either we make reductions, you have 2 options, raise taxes, or make reductions in spending when there's a downturn. This is a hypothetical recession scenario. So just an order of magnitude, we took the previous recessions and did a simulation of what would happen in New York State. And the range in the past 3 recessions, the range of revenue loss is between 36 to 50 billion over the 3-year period. So the size of the losses just illustrate the challenge, right, of setting aside significant reserves to weather a downturn. So even with the level of 15% reserves, right, you can pay for about half of these scenario revenue losses. Now, perhaps they won't be that dramatic next time, and perhaps there'll be other funds available, but this insulates us from that, and those are real world. We've seen it before. So these are the deposits to the principal reserves that we've been talking about. In the current year, $5 billion in the reserves as a deposit. And again, that is, and then we do spend another $5 billion in surplus. So the $5 billion in surplus is on top of the $5 billion that we're putting away in the plan deposits. So this allows us to do both. Make the investments while also planning for the future. And also remember, this money is not in the bank. We do not have all of the funds for these deposits today. We have the funds for the deposit in 22 today. We believe in 23. That deposit also is in our plan. And the 24 and 25 deposits are assuming that our revenue, that we'd have no more shocks, which we talked about, happen periodically, and no one knows when they are, and that the revenues continue at the current, not the current rate of growth, but continue without reversing. So by 2025, we get to the 15%. What are the risks to the plan? We have sudden catastrophic events that we've seen. Again, 9/11, Great Recession, COVID-19, you name it, Superstorm Sandy, right? And then there are other trends that we are watching that could erode the state's wealth over time. We have slow population growth, which the governor has talked about previously, tax migration. So if there are people who are moving to other parts of the state over the parts of the country. And then we have telework, which is a new trend that was accelerated as a result of COVID. And depending on where they go, right, our ability, both the state's and New York's ability, right, to tax individuals who are working for New York companies but are located in other parts of the state for long periods of time, may be challenged. Short memories and optimism is just, we forget sometimes some of the down cycles and what we had to do, and over-optimism, if that's a word, but people being too optimistic about what is going to happen in the future. And you spend to that point, and again, you end up going backwards, right? And I think it's more important to have certainty. So overall, this budget invests smartly. We prepare for the future. We're mitigating risks that we're seeing, and we're building reserves at a level that has not been seen before. So thank you.
We'll take questions. You raise your hand, and then after you guys, we'll go to Zoom.
Robert, so does this include any talk of rolling back the corporate tax increases from last year that I know they're in effect with 2024, and then we're washing cash, but is there any consideration there or in the following years?
No, the focus has been on building the reserves first before we talk about those. There are some small business tax cuts here for small businesses and a targeted, but we're not undoing, the tax increases that were done last year. The tax increases that were done last year were also designed specifically to fund the increases in foundation aid. So we're fulfilling that commitment. It's tied directly to those increases, which were to fund that. So, those are lining up, and we're continuing those commitments.
Have you used any of the surplus funds or federal funds for that in order to keep up reserves as opposed to, again, the tax increase?
I would say no, because again, we're trying to track one-time spending with one-time resources and have ongoing spending tied to ongoing programs, to ongoing resources. So the taxes are ongoing resources. They'll continue. The federal spending is not. It's one time. So we wanted to tie that to one-time spending.
So I have, hi, Robert.
Hi.
Karen DeWitt. I have some gambling-related questions. I noticed you had the numbers on the mobile sports betting. First, wondering if that was higher than anticipated rate of gaming that happened. Also, the budget allows for 3 new casinos. Would those be in the New York City area, or where would they be located?
So the current law just didn't identify where the casinos would be located. It was just, so we're not changing that. All we're doing is reauthorizing the 3. There'll be a competition for them, and there is, there's always going to be a concern about creating competition amongst the 4 that are upstate, but there's no specific designation that they have to be in New York City. And on the mobile sports betting, I think we've seen it has been, its launch has been a success. We have over 600,000 unique accounts that were created in the first week. It's closer probably to 700,000 by now. So I think, some of the concerns, I think we're seeing it play out. People seem to be very engaged, and I think all of the participants, both on the player side and on the gambling side or the corporate side, are all seeing what they expected. We expected our revenues will meet our targets both this year and next year, if not exceed them. I think we are now #1 in the nation in that regard. And I think what's different about our program than other programs is that 50% of those revenues go to education, and as opposed to other parts of the country where they mostly go to the private sector.
So the budget book mentions that the governor is proposing to subject all vacation rentals to state and local sales taxes. I assume that applies to Airbnb. Could you confirm that, and could you just elaborate on any other significant new sources of tax revenue?
So that's not a new source of tax revenue. Under current law, you're required to pay taxes on all of those. And the issue is that there's not a clear mechanism for collecting it. About 35 counties have entered into side agreements in order to collect it. So what happens is someone who's using one of those platforms, right, has to individually, supposed to, collect the tax and then remit it. And because there is no mechanism for them to do it. So the industry is asking so that we don't have 35 different counties coming up with their own schemes. The taxes are in law, so there's not new taxes. This is, if there's a hotel occupancy tax, you're supposed to tax it. If there's a sales tax, it's supposed to be taxed. So this just, puts them, instead of avoiding the tax or making it difficult for people who are participating in these platforms, right? This would establish a way for the platform to charge the tax and then remit it to the state. So that just clarifies what is current law, because unfortunately, without the ability to do that, there is no mechanism for any of these to collect the tax.
Just to clarify, there's no significant sources of new tax revenue for the state in this.
There are no tax increases, right? That's a current law. So there are no tax or fee increases in this budget.
Robert, how is the state affording to cut taxes this year for the middle class, especially with all the pandemic costs? And in regard to the tax rebate, the property tax rebate mentioned, how many New Yorkers are expected to qualify, and what's the anticipated relief?
So it's $2.2 billion, and there are about 2 million taxpayers who will be eligible. It's a progressive program that'll run off of, similar to the STAR relief program. So it's tied to STAR. It's tied to how much people pay in property taxes in relation to their income, and the benefit is a sliding scale based on that. It's capped at $250,000 income, which is the same cap that applies for the current STAR program. So, and those are relief checks, and again, we have a surplus. We're doing major commitments in spending, both on the education side, healthcare side, mental hygiene side, and all of these areas. But we also thought it's important to give some of that dividend back to people who, New Yorkers who have both suffered through the pandemic and need relief.
Robert, just to clarify, are you saying that, what is Governor Hochul's position on authorizing casinos in New York City?
We're proposing an RFP, or an RFA, that's what they call it, they tell me. We're proposing an RFA that we will issue in order to get bids in so that we can select. There'll be a board that makes a selection process for casinos across the state. Largely the three will be, probably focused in the downstate area, but there's no restriction there, right? If we have to get some, a bid back that's dramatic, we're not going to exclude them. But the budget is going to, right now you have to wait till 2023, otherwise you have to pay a penalty to the 4 casinos that are operating. We're pulling that forward and saying, we're going to start this year, that process. We don't have a date. We have to wait for this to be passed by our legislature, but then we'll put out an RFA, get bids back, and make awards for the additional licenses if we have bids, that are, worthy of a new license.
And then globally, about $3.4 billion just in FY23, kind of immediately out the door. Can you talk about your consideration for doing that in the form of the rebate checks and the health worker bonuses, as opposed to maybe some one-time cash bonuses, one-time capital projects and capital expenditures for anything, the MTA, burying I-81, a new stadium for that team in Buffalo?
We're doing both. I didn't go through some of the investments in the infrastructure, but as I mentioned, we want to tie the one-time resources to one-time spending. So we do have a highway and bridge plan, it's $32.8 billion. It's the largest highway and bridge plan in history. It funds major projects across the state. We call them mega projects, everywhere from every part of the state. We have projects in New York City, projects in Buffalo, projects in, in the capital region. So, and we used some of that, we said $1 billion of it was going into the Highway and Bridge Fund. There's actually a little bit more in PAYGO already in that fund. So that's that infrastructure. And then within the budget, you'll see there's also $1 billion and $1.6 billion in the healthcare space, one-time capital expenditure. Those are the larger ones. And then there's a lot of infrastructure investment. So I think it was both. So we did the reason we want to use the rebate check as the mechanism, because again, it's one time, you can get it back, and then, but then also the other one-time places that we're making investments is in infrastructure. And you'll see in the plan, we have a significant amount of PAYGO in this plan, more than we've had in the past.
Build on Bernadette's question. FY27, you said you got balances through there. That's when the higher PIT surcharges expire. Are you setting the state up fiscally to let those expire, or are you, as you sort of alluded earlier, setting up if they are matched with the higher levels of education funding that are currently baked into the multi-year projections, are you setting them up to be renewed?
I think the determination on that is going to be made, years from now, right? I think, but we'll see what happens between now and then. But what we're not doing is like spending to the edge there, where it's requiring, right, that everything gets renewed. So I think what this does is create a glide path for the federal money to fall off, right, and to show that we can make these commitments, keep them ongoing without having any out-year gaps. And these are any out-year gaps. And as you know, we would talk about small gaps, before $3 billion in the out years, $3 billion, and now you're talking about, about zeros, and it's zeros after, you make these significant deposits. So I think the legislature, working with the executive, will make determinations on, the extensions of taxes, years from now. But this budget, positions you well.
Robert, the governor said that she wanted to abolish and replace the 421A program. She didn't really offer any details.
And I'm sorry, I didn't hear what program?
The 421A tax cut for developers. She said she wanted to abolish and replace it with something new. Didn't really offer any details. Don't see any new details in the budget. Is there any sort of update about what a proposed new budget and how those state funds would be used? Is there a new proposed program as part of the budget and how those state funds will be used, as she says, in a better way to ensure affordable housing?
Mm-hmm. In the housing space, there's a new $25 billion, and this goes to some of the questions on the other investments. I didn't go through all of them, but we have a $32.8 billion highway and bridge plan. We have a $25 billion housing plan, right, that has over the next 5 years as well. The previous housing plan was $20 billion, so this is $25 billion. And then with regards to 421A program, the 421A program will expire, and there'll be a successor program that just tries to deal with making deeper affordability, right, for more people. And that will be in the bills that, if they're not, whenever they're posted sometime today. So you'll see the details of a successor program that provides both affordability while encouraging, right, in the creation of investment in additional housing. And that's separate from the $25 billion in the housing plan, but the details will be in the budget bills.
Details you can provide right now for being produced.
I don't have the levels of affordability, particularly, because it is a little complicated, the program, but you'll see them shortly.
Robert, I wanted to ask a couple questions on the Medicaid program. I saw that the global cap was up to now 4.7. Can you talk about why that was raised from 2.9? And, at this point, what is sort of the need for this cap? And we've seen throughout many budget cycles, they're sort of playing around with what's included, what's happened, and what's not. And then also, I saw that you guys are restoring the 1% across-the-board cuts that happened at the end of 2019 to offset the $6 billion Medicaid shortfall. Is there any other things like that that are being reversed, those cost-cutting measures from NRT2 that are being reversed in this budget?
Yeah. So there had not been any rate increases of significance in the Medicaid space in over a decade. And we were tracking revenues to what was affordable. And in the Medicaid space, that's why we did the MRT. And the MRT was designed to reduce the cost of Medicaid, to bring it in line with revenues, right? And I think you can see in the tables I went through, we had gaps in all of those years. So the rationale for the MRT is we have to help to close the gaps, and you can't have Medicaid spending growing at 6, 7, 8% when revenues are only growing at 2%, especially when that's 25% of the budget. So that's the rationale there. Now
You said that it's growing by over 6%, but then the cap is 4.7.
Yeah.
And I know that there's some, some of those federal, some of those state, but I mean, if we traditionally see Medicaid growing by about 6%, why have the cap set below that rate?
So we haven't moved things in and out of the cap. There are things that have always been out of the cap, and those are still outside the cap. So we wanted to be an apples to apples comparison, right? We didn't want to say we're increasing the cap, oh, but by the way, we're adding new expenditures in the cap, therefore it really didn't go up, right? So what we're just doing here is saying, keeping it, all things being equal, the cap goes up. Why is the cap going up? Because two things. One is it wasn't tracking. It was designed originally to track to medical CPI, and it wasn't. So medical CPI was growing at higher rates than the Medicaid cap was, so costs were growing faster, or rising faster than the cap. So this metric is directly tied to growth in the healthcare space. And then as a result of the pandemic, right, what we're seeing is there was a lot of damage to the healthcare sector, right, as a result of the pandemic, particularly also on the employment side, right? So we're seeing, right, the state is paying, contract nurses that we're trying to find. Everyone in the country is trying to find nurses, home care workers. If you look at the whole healthcare space, there are shortages of workers everywhere. Somewhere between 70 and 85% of the healthcare spend is for wages. So when we talk about increasing money in the healthcare space, a lot of that's going right to increase wages for healthcare workers. So no, only home care wages are not. So home care wages were not put in as it dealt with the minimum wage, but hospital funding, nursing home funding, all of that is running through the global cap. So the rationale is right now is, as a result of the pandemic, we see what's going on. We need to invest in that space. Is the global cap appropriate right now? No, because we saw that it wasn't tracking to CPI. And is it affordable? The answer is yes, because we've shown that it can be affordable. So we're making a larger investment there. It's similar to what we did on the education side as well, right? There was a education income growth factor, right, that was tracking education. The decision was that we wanted to fund foundation aid, right, set aside that growth factor here, and it was always about, is it affordable, and does the current tax base support the increase? And here the answer is yes, as demonstrated by the deposits to reserves and the zero gaps.
And then are there any of the MRT2 proposals that are being clawed back in this budget, aside from that 1% cross-border cut that happened?
Yeah, and I would say the issue with it's 1.5%, and the issue there was it doesn't make sense to kind of keep the 1.5% on the board and then add, right, 1%. Then you're not doing anything. So the way it's structured is that we have to take away that in order for it. So it's either you count it as taking away 1.5%, or you just count it as increasing 1.5%. But you have to do both in order to get them just 1%. Otherwise, you're just going in a circle.
David? Robert, could you clarify that the Western New York State funding would be through pay-go infrastructure funding from the federal government? And also, could you also talk a little bit more about the proposal to allow county governments to increase their sales tax on and off without approval from this bill?
Here's the second one. So every 2 years, right, the state has to approve the county sales tax and the counties are looking for certainty, right? It's one thing in budgeting. I know it, I'm doing 4-year, 5-year plans out, right? Certainty. The counties, one of the major revenue streams for county governments, the major revenue stream for most county governments, aside from the property tax cap, is the sales tax. And depending on the county, sales tax is number 1 or number 2. So local governments want certainty. They don't want to know every 2 years that a portion of their sales tax may expire, have to come to the legislature. So what we're proposing here is if there's no change, right, and we've seen historically, we never go backwards on these, right? It's a process we go through. Just leave them the way they are. If you want an increase, then we can come to the legislature for an increase. But it helps in long-term budgeting for local governments and also for their, debt service and their bond ratings to know that they have a permanent sales tax that is in place, because it's somewhat of a, it's just a little bit of a farce that's going to expire every time and turn it back. So the governor is very focused on helping local governments and wanting to make sure, right, that they have the tools. And this is an easy one, doesn't cost anything, but gives them certainty.
Rob,
On the
West New York State.
Yeah, the West New York State, there hasn't been any determination because we don't have a dollar number of, of what the contribution would be yet. Those talks are ongoing. So once we,
Appropriation in the capital projects bill for that.
there's not an appropriation for that, that's right.
Rob, just so I have it on tape, what specifically is the $224 million for anti-violence efforts being spent on?
There's a whole list of programs, right, that I don't have. There are violence interveners, right? There are funds for various community programs, including infrastructure, right, for alternatives, after-school type programs, and there's a whole host. It's about, I believe it's like $60 million more than was spent last year on the programs, and we're looking at each program to see which programs are working. We'll refund those and increase those, and if programs are not, we'll try new ones. But this is something that, we've looked at programs across the country to see what's working. And the gun violence in the cities, particularly, right, has gained, a lot of attention from you all, and in the communities, people have identified it as something that, is causing them a lot of concern, and it causes the governor a lot of concern. So we want to put these resources in there. It's mostly for non-police resources, right? This is for trying to avoid the violence before it actually happens.
As far as the distribution goes, is that something that after the budget passes, it all just goes out in a lump sum to whoever it's supposed to be doled out to? Or do you do it incrementally over time so you can determine what's working and then pull funding from ineffective programs?
It's over time, but we don't want to hold it, right, because the problem is now, so we want to get money out now. So it's that balance, right, between making sure that, you want the money now because this money actually will save lives, and then just making sure that we're watching it to see what's working and what's not, and then we can calibrate throughout the year, and so that's how it'll work.
And the last one, how do you determine whether or not a program is effective? And is there like a grace period? Because it seems like every few months there is a new program that's going into effect where it's like, here's another approach, because nothing has ultimately stopped the problem. So what is the metric? How do you measure the efficacy?
Yeah. That's a complicated, right, a very complicated thing, because you're trying to measure, right, do dollars spent in this area actually result in a decrease? And then even if there is a decrease, right, was it the result of that thing? Anecdotally, you can see it, right, so you can identify, right, there's a specific person, may have been helped by this program, and but for this, right, may have been the victim of a violent act or perpetrated a violent act, right? So we know anecdotally. What's harder, right, is saying that we know that if we do this, this will be the answer. So it's difficult, and people have been trying to do, right, program measurement for a very long time, and it's complicated. We're using experts to look at them, and we want to invest it smartly. That's why we've set aside the resources, but we're open to programs that work. What we don't want to do is just continue funding programs just because we fund them the year before. And that is something that the governor has been very focused on. She does not want to fund programs just because they've been funded the year before. You have to demonstrate that they work. DCJS, Division of Criminal Justice Service, will look at those programs and say if it's not working, then we need to move the resources to someone else.
Our Buffalo affiliate is wondering if...
Clarify, the increase in child care spending, is that all federal dollars?
No, it's state.
How much is it
state resources to increase. So there was federal dollars last year that were spent over multiple years, but we're also using state dollars to increase the eligibility for child care subsidies to families that are 300% of the federal poverty level, which is $79,500 or $600, depending on who you ask. And that'll allow for 400,000 children in New York State, more children, to be eligible for those subsidies. And we're funding that with state dollars. There's some federal money in there, but that rolls off, and we're fully funding it with state dollars in the out years.
Can I add one?
Robert, you talked about tax migration. What is the state doing to counter that? Because I know Governor Kathy Hochul talked about I think 300,000 people that moved out throughout the pandemic according to census numbers. So what is this budget do to prevent that tax migration? And also, do you have a figure on how many of our top earners that in that 1% bracket that have left the state throughout the pandemic, and that would potentially pose a big hit to the fiscal projections throughout the next couple of years?
So we don't have exact numbers because this is also, right, it's complicated to see these people in and out. We have more millionaires now than we had before, right, because overall stock market's doing better. So we're creating wealth. We'd like to create wealth and keep everyone here at the same time. But as we all know, there's been some migration. The migration has actually been from New York City. The largest part of the migration has been from New York City to outside of New York City, still within New York State. So we have people that have moved out of New York City but moved to Hudson Valley, moved to Long Island. That's the biggest part of it. And what's the cause of that? That is largely pandemic related. So as a result of the pandemic, right, and the restrictions and the density, right, part of living in New York City is there's lots of things to do in New York City to have fun. And when you close those things down, go someplace else. So with that ending, hopefully, so I think it's directly tied to, as COVID goes away or we figure out how to live with it, all of the reasons that people live in New York City, right, comes back, and then people will still want to live there. Young people still want to live in New York City. If we're looking at anything as to what's going on, look at the real estate market. Rents are up, again, over what they were pre-pandemic. Sales of condos are up again, over what they were pre-pandemic. So the real estate market, which everyone wrote about was tanking, right, during the pandemic, has come back and higher than it was. So that shows that's competition. That means people actually want to live there, they want to rent apartments, and they want to buy. So the best thing you can do, right, is make New York better than it was before, right, open things up, and that happens only as COVID goes away. Our responses, the governor's responses to COVID this year, right, have been different than they were before, right? We learned more, the restrictions are less, and there's more for people to do. So crime has been an issue, right? So people looking at that. So we're looking at the things, adding money, right, for gun violence, adding money in the budget to deal with homelessness, right? So those are other things that we're doing in the budget, dealing with affordability in terms of housing, right? And the $2 billion to deal with impacts of the coronavirus. All of those things are designed, right, to bring back normalcy. And when you bring that back, we think people will come back.
Robert, does just really quickly, does the budget include funding for a new Buffalo Bills stadium?
No, I think that question was asked twice. So the answer is no.
I'm going to jump over to Zoom right now. Good afternoon, everybody. Your first question, Director, comes from Marina Villanueva from the Associated Press. Marina, your mic is open.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, I apologize. I wasn't able to hear all of the questions. I was wondering if there's any evidence that the tax hike last year has led to wealthy individuals or big corps fleeing New York. And does this budget proposal expect that the corporate tax hike is going to expire in 2024 and the personal income tax rate is going to sunset by 2028?
Yeah, so the budget assumes that current law, we're not changing current law. So the way we do our financial plans is we assume that if a tax is going to expire, that it expires in the absence of legislation that changes it. So anything that's scheduled to expire is assumed that it will expire in this plan.
And is there any evidence that those tax hikes has led to wealthy individuals or big corporations fleeing New York?
We haven't seen any evidence of that. If anything, right, those, some of those tax increases were, on the margin compared to the impact of SALT, right? The impact of SALT on those very people was dramatically greater than the marginal tax increase that the state did. So if there was anything, right, it would be hard to separate the impact of what Washington did to the state with regard to SALT from the increases, the relatively small increases on the income tax side. Now, not that they're small increases, but in scale, SALT is far disproportional to anything that we did. So if there is any tax migration, it would be the result, because of that, it would be the result of SALT, because that was dramatically different, and it impacts New York particularly hard. We attempted to deal with that, right, through some of our tax changes that we have in our budget, and I think many taxpayers are taking advantage of that who would have been impacted by the damaging effects of SALT. So we hope that that's blunting the attack from Washington on the state as a result of SALT.
Thank you very much, Director. Your next question comes from John Campbell of WNYC. John, your mic is open.
Hi, Rob, one more time on the casino proposal here. So is the governor proposing speeding up the process from 2023 to 2022 and eliminating that penalty that would have had to been paid to the other casinos?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And then also two programs that are mentioned in the briefing book, but I don't believe they're getting additional funding. The Emergency Rental Assistance Program and the Excluded Workers Fund. What went into the decision not to put state funds into those programs, which, as you know, are essentially depleted?
Mm-hmm. Well, the ERAP program is a federal program, right? So that program was entirely funded by the federal government, and the governor has had conversations with her colleagues in Washington on getting additional resources. They have said they're going to make some decisions on additional resources as they reprogram money, in March. So we're looking at the federal funding first to see if, right, there are additional resources for these individuals. However, we understand that there's still an impact from COVID. There's still an economic impact for these individuals with regard to rent, and also the small landlords, right, that are trying to pay for the upkeep of their buildings in the absence of rent. So that we also did set aside, right, $2 billion for pandemic relief efforts, and all of these things will be, in conversations with the legislature as to where the priorities lie.
Director, your next question comes from Andrew Donovan of WGRZ-TV. Andrew, your mic is open.
Director Mujica, thanks for your availability.
Thank you.
I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on the bonuses for nurses and other healthcare workers. I know it's $1.2 billion in total, up to $3,000 full-time, 1 year of service. Could you kind of explain how the $3,000 is allocated, how much each person gets, the factors that go into that determination, and kind of speak directly to healthcare workers, how they can expect this money eventually from state government?
Yeah. So the money would go to their employers, right? So the way it would work, and this is at a very high level, the employers will provide a definition which is in the statute or the proposed legislation that the governor's submitting today. There'll be a definition, right? What is the healthcare worker that was on the front line? Identify the workers that are eligible, the healthcare workers who, worked in the front lines, were hands-on, working with patients, right, before, and also for new healthcare workers, right, because it's a retention and also a desire to create an incentive for more people to enter the field, because we're seeing a lot of shortages, which you're all aware of. So that's the eligibility part. You let the employer, right, this is the definition, they will then tell us, right, these are the people that are eligible, and then we will then provide those resources to the employer to pay those individuals. So it'll run from the state through the employer, which will go to the individual healthcare workers. For the full $3,000, it's for full-time workers. And as a way to provide incentive for retention, what we're saying is we want people to be working for 12 months to receive the full $3,000. However, for workers that are currently working, if they've already worked 6 months or more, that 6 months will count towards the year, so they can get, and the check will come in 2 parts. So for those employers that are presently working and have worked for 6 months or at the 6-month point, they'll get the first half, and then the second half will come on the 12-month period. So that's basically how it operates.
Director, your next question comes from Rima Amin from Chalkbeat. Rima, your mic is open.
Hi, thanks for having this. So my first question, I just wanted to know about the specific dollar investments that are that the governor is proposing to go towards the teacher pipeline and getting more teachers into the pipeline. I know some of that is supposed to maybe be for SED and hiring more workers there to speed up the certification process, but can you talk more about what those proposed expenses will look like?
There's about $350 million dedicated to workforce recruitment and retention. There are a few programs which I don't have off the top of my head in the education space. On the resource side in the education space, right, there are a lot of resources in the education space that have been provided to school districts over the last year and a half. So school districts across the state have gotten about $15 billion in federal money to be spent over 3 years, on top of $3 billion in school aid this year, this current year, $2 billion proposed for next year, and then upwards of $2 to $3 billion the year after. So from a resource perspective, a lot of school districts, most school districts, I don't know that any, right, have spent all of their federal money. So from a resource perspective, there are a lot of resources going into school districts. But what we found, and a lot of employers have found, it's not all about the resources or the salaries. It's about other factors and bringing more, and the pipeline of getting people to want to go into some of these careers. And I think that's what some of the focuses of the 350 in the workforce is, to identify, again, licensing criteria, alternative teacher certification, and educational costs, right, associated with tuition, paying tuition, forgiving tuition, all of those things. So there's a whole, there's a group of programs that are, funded in the budget. I don't have the specific details, but the point is that there are resources in the higher education, in the education space, and then there are also specific workforce initiatives targeted towards teachers.
Thank you, Director Mujica. Your next question comes from Keisha Clucky of Bloomberg. Keisha, your mic is open. Keisha, go ahead and open your mic.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just had a quick question, again, to clarify the middle class tax relief. So is it a reduction, a rate drop for the personal income taxes, or is it a rebate? And if it is a personal income tax rate drop, do you have any specifics on what that would mean for single filers and so forth by bracket?
I don't have the specifics of the, because for every individual, it is going to be different, right, based on both their income and based on the property taxes that they pay. So it'll vary in different parts of the state, right, and based on, what their property taxes are. Also, what their property taxes are in relation to their income. It will be an advance refund, so it is off your personal income taxes, but we will advance it as we've done before, so similar to previous rebate proposals. Instead of having to wait, if we did it this year, you'd have to wait until your 2022 tax filing, which wouldn't happen until 2023. So what we're doing is providing an advance refund so people will get the benefit today and not have to wait till when they file their taxes.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Director. A couple more questions coming at you from Zoom. Your next comes from Marie French of Politico. Marie, your mic is open.
Hey, thank you. Can you hear me all right there?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, I was just wondering if you could offer any specifics on the amount of transportation aid that will be available to school districts to electrify their bus fleets. It's briefly mentioned in the book, but I don't see any specifics about amounts. You know, that's probably a pretty costly transition in some cases.
It is. The buses cost, upwards of double to more, right, than the current buses. There's some federal resources that are going to be available for this. There are some off-budget resources from part of some of our climate change agenda that will be available for this. And then also school districts would be eligible for transportation aid for these investments. So depending on the school district and the relative wealth of the school district, there's formulas for transportation aid. In some school districts, the transportation aid is as high as 80%, maybe even more. So in those school districts, the state's going to be reimbursing, right, a large portion of those costs. So it's a combination of we'll provide state transportation aid on them, and then there's grants both on the federal side and on the state side that are off budget.
Great, thank you. And is there a date that the state expects to stop purchasing fossil fuel vehicles for its fleet?
We are trying to phase it out. I forget the date that's put in there. We've put money in the budget to phase it out over multiple years, the light duty fleet. But I don't have the exact date, but it should be published in the materials that you'll get today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Your next question comes from Michael Gormley of Newsday. But you need to take a sip of water first.
Thank you. Okay. Hello, Michael.
Hi, Rob.
All right,
Hi, Rob,
so Mike, your mic's open.
Thank you. Rob, does this indicate that 2% spending cap that has been underway for several years has been abandoned? And then just to take them together, if that spending goes over 3% now each year, and the tax rebate is a one-time rebate, I mean, really, what are you looking for these people to address that issue of the exodus of people? It doesn't look like there's much other than some of these smaller benefits for people who are already here. And I know you've answered some of this question, but I just really, what's in here to change that exodus of people from the state?
Well, it depends, right? You have to figure out what is, I don't know if it's an exodus, right? But there's an issue of migration, right? That has happened, and there are trends. And one thing is to figure out what are the drivers for that, right? Besides maybe wanting to go to warmer places. So one is figure out what it is. We've put in, but there's a lot of resources here, right, that help all New Yorkers, right? We have billions of dollars into the healthcare system. We have one of the best healthcare systems in the, in the country. People come from all over, not only the country, but the world, right, to some of our hospitals. Our education system, investments in higher education that the governor has made, right? So these are all things that benefit all New Yorkers. We've increased fundings for tuition assistance programs. So there's a lot of programs that we've done here that are investments for people to, right, to benefit from and provide opportunity for New Yorkers, right? The pandemic was a very unique thing that we're still monitoring as to, what the impacts are there. As far as other investments, again, we're accelerating the middle class tax cut. The taxes on New Yorkers from a state side are at the lowest they've been in decades. The property tax, which the state does not control, but has been capped at 2%, has reduced what was property tax growth of 4%, 5%, and 6% per year prior to the property tax cap. The property tax cap is staying in place. So that has, over the long term, right, reduced the growth of property taxes. So that's there. And then the rebate checks are that's just a way to give back some of the dividend, right, to some of the taxpayers, and the taxpayers that are paying some of the highest taxes, because the highest taxes in New York on individuals are actually the property tax, right, not the personal income tax. So there are a lot of investments that the state is making, right, that impact people in their everyday lives, and I think that is the focus of the governor's budget.
I understand that, Rob, but the 2% spending level, what's happening to that? And also, I mean, I understand what you're talking about with all these programs here, but what's the big change to show that New York is going to be attracting more people? The change, you have a $5 billion surplus, and although I see the reserves you're adding to, you're still spending a lot of money when it comes in. What's changing the trajectory, and what about that 2% spending cap?
Right. So I think your focus is on taxes, right? The spending that's being done, again, the $7 billion in one-time spending, and then there are investments in both healthcare and education. So one argument would be we should not invest in education, and we should not do the investments in the Medicaid space that we're doing. I think everyone wants hospitals to be functioning, nursing homes to be functioning. Everyone wants to be able to have a home care person available when they need one. So we can have a discussion on whether or not we should make those investments in those areas. We think New Yorkers want them. With regard to the cap, again, the cap was related to maintain spending growth and align it with revenues, right? So even with the spending cap in place, like the chart that I showed you, we had out-year gaps in each one of those years. Now, we're going above, right, that benchmark, and we have no gaps in the out years and revenues over and above. So the alternative would be, what are you doing with all, you could not do the spending and then just leave, $10 billion on the table. The spending cap was actually, and then to go to the 2%, last year, spending was over 8.5%, or the current year, right? And that was not the Governor Hochul's budget. That was the prior administration's budget. So the prior administration did not adhere to the 2% spending cap last year. That was, it was spending in over 8.5%. So it's not this administration that stopped. It was a recognition, right, that you need to make investments in this time, in particular at this moment, to respond to what is going on, right, in the real world. Governor Hochul does it responsibly while building reserves so that you don't have to raise taxes in an economic downturn, so that you have reserves to make sure that you're not cutting it, and the alternatives are not just either cut or raise taxes. Now we have reserves to kind of mitigate that. So I think it's a responsible plan. The alternative, if you kept to, a lower spending number artificially, you would have, right, some of these other resources that would just fall to the bottom, would remain as surplus, and you wouldn't be able to deal with some of the priorities that people have identified, including, right, funding our education, funding our healthcare space. So it's a debate that could be had. We'll have that conversation with the legislature, and this is the executive's proposal.
Director, your next question comes from Joe Mahoney of CNHI Newspapers. Joe, your mic is open.
Hello?
Go ahead and open your mic, Joe.
Hi, Rob.
Hello.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Hello? Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know if you can hear me. I just saw you
can
on
hear
mute.
you loud and clear.
Okay, let me hit that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello? No?
Yes.
Hi, Rob.
Yes. Hello.
Hi. On SUNY, I'm looking at two data sets. One indicates that 20% enrollment decline over the past decade. Another is the reduction in enrollment at K through 12 schools throughout the state, particularly upstate, over at least the last decade, and maybe over the last 20 years. So SUNY draws from K through 12, a certain percentage of the students come through New York public schools. Did you look at that when you decided to allocate 1.5 billion to both SUNY and CUNY over the next 5 years? And is there any concern over the enrollment situation at SUNY? Governor Hochul, during the Malatras scandal, talked about an overhaul of SUNY. Is there anything in this budget that backs that up, that deals with an overhaul of SUNY?
Yeah, the governor has outlined a proposal for SUNY that was in her State of the State. SUNY's, they're in a search for a chancellor in SUNY, and she will propose an overhaul in conjunction with the new administration, right, at SUNY. With regards to the funding increases at SUNY, these are targeted investments. Adding additional faculty is important. We're looking at the enrollment declines. They're largely in the community colleges, not the senior colleges. It's a broader conversation about how many community colleges you have, and and are they providing all of the programs that are needed in this economy, and that is part of what the governor is talking about when she talks about overhauling SUNY and making it, the SUNY of the future. We've seen differences within SUNY and CUNY with regards to some of these enrollments, but these trends are not just SUNY and CUNY trends, they're national trends. So if you look nationally at publics, you will find similar enrollment declines in institutions across the country. So it's a broader issue relating to higher education, not just SUNY or CUNY in New York State. You add, right, the pandemic on top of that, right, and it kind of distorts the issue. But we're aware of the long-term trends. The privates are seeing them as well. The community colleges see a little more profoundly. So the answer is yes. We're aware of those numbers. We still want to make investments in the systems, but it doesn't mean that it's the status quo either. And I don't think the governor is satisfied with status quo. And so we'll be looking to make sure that those investments are made appropriately for the very reason you talk about. It's about creating opportunity, right, and places that people want to go so they can be educated. Part-time TAP is a proposal from the governor, and that also kind of addresses this issue too, right? Not everyone can be a full-time student. Not everyone needs a BA to get a job. Not every job requires a BA any longer. So by allowing part-time TAP, you allow individual students to be able to work, take courses that are not necessarily degree-bearing courses, and be able to use that to get a job. And that actually, some of that can take place at some of the community colleges. So funding is part of the solution. It's not the only part of the solution. The governor recognizes that, and that's why she's proposing the SUNY overhaul. But that will take, it takes time to turn around that ship.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Your next question comes from Casey Jones of the Allegheny Hope Community News. Casey, your mic is open.
Good afternoon. I've listened to your presentation, and it sounded like you were very optimistic in regard to the pathway forward for the next 5 years, with the caveats, of course, that there not be another catastrophe such as the pandemic, and the whole aspect of short memories and optimism, because when you have the money that you seem to be seeing here as being available to put into reserve,
will return to normal levels of growth. But we're not going to spend to the level of what is, what we just saw and these very large increases. Because again, we all saw the pandemic, we all saw how dramatic the decline happened, and then we saw it pop back up. This is not sustainable at this level. We will return to a level of normalcy. Prior to the pandemic, right, it was a relatively slow growth period, right, where GDP was growing at 2% and 3% for a decade. So we anticipate that we will return to more normal levels of growth. We're not overly optimistic in our out-year forecasts, but we are optimistic that the state is growing and that these investments are the right ones at the time, while setting aside stuff for rainy days, because they come and they can come at any time.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Director. Your next question comes from Dave Colon of Streets Blog. Dave, your mic is open.
Hey, Rob, how's it going?
Hello. Good.
Great. You're an MTA guy, so I'm sure that you're aware that General Lieber was on the record at the end of last year saying that it's time to reconsider long-term revenue sources for the MTA and treat it more like an essential service, police, firefighters, so on, and fund it that way. Does the governor have any appetite for that kind of long-term revenue shift, new long-term revenues in this year's budget?
I think that we're looking at the finances, right, of the MTA right now, as a result of the influx of federal dollars. They don't have an operating gap until 2025. So it gives us some time to, look at the MTA. A lot of what is happening at the MTA is a result of the significant decline in ridership that has not returned as a result of the pandemic. Some of that will return, but they're also subject to, right, what happens with, work from home and those kinds of activities in New York City, right? So I think we all need to look at the MTA and just see what long-term, right, what is sustainable. The MTA has maintained operations, largely. Recently, there's been, some service reductions, but that's in relation to Omicron and, staff getting sick and not having enough employees to operate the systems at the optimal levels. But there's time to look at the MTA and figure out what is the path forward there. So I'm sure that the chairman, will have a long-term operational plan, that we can all, work on together. The good news for the MTA is that the dedicated taxes, so just like the revenues for New York State have increased as a result of this recovery, so have they for the MTA. Our forecasts project that there will be a few $100 million more in dedicated revenues than they had forecast in their November plan just 3 months ago. So that's positive for the MTA, it's positive for their bottom line. And again, if those revenues continue, right, for multiple years, then, it'll put them in a much better position than they are today. But they're in a crisis, and I know the chairman's focused on it.
Thank you, Director. We have time for just 2 more questions. So your next question comes from Emma Whitford of Law 360. Emma, your mic is open.
Hi there. I had a quick question about the $2 billion for pandemic recovery initiatives. Is that all state dollars? That's the first part of my question.
Yes, it's 100% state dollars. It's part of the current year surplus.
And back to the ERAP question. This is also a bit of a two-parter, but my understanding is that there's no money specifically marked currently for ERAP in the budget proposal.
Right, not specifically, but again.
Not specifically, but are you saying that some of that $2 billion could potentially go towards ERAP or some other sort of rental assistance program?
Yeah, I think the governor mentioned in her comments this morning, right? Those monies are available for coronavirus relief efforts or spending. ERAP is one of those things. So it's a conversation that we welcome to have with the legislature. Right? There are other coronavirus-related spending items that other people are talking about. But I think the responsible thing was like to set this money aside and let's have the conversation with the legislature about what the priorities are. But there's nothing that would preclude the use of those funds for the ERAP program at some point. The focus on ERAP, though, is that ERAP is a federal program, and there are federal resources, right, that are available for this. And we recognize, again, the impact and the hardship that renters who have been most dramatically impacted by the pandemic had in not being able to pay their rent. However, we are now seeing a recovery, right, and where, there are, more jobs available, more opportunities available. We are seeing declines in the coronavirus, so we are turning the corner. So as we move forward, we don't want to leave anyone behind, make sure people get taken care of, but we also want to make sure that we're pivoting beyond programs that were, specifically designed for the pandemic to focus on growing out of it.
Thanks, everyone. Again, this is our last question as the director has to go after this. So, Director, your last question comes from Josh Solomon of the Albany Times-Union. Josh, your mic is open.
No pressure, last question. Hi there, Director. One question, just stepping back a bit. Obviously, Washington has been debating a lot of big legislation. How has that kind of factored into this budget, if at all? And if the passage of Build Back Better was to pass, would that change any of the calculations here? And if you do have time, real quickly, one kind of targeted question about the farm credit overtime tax credit. There's a line in the budget book about it. If you know, to what extent is that there to fully cover overtime, especially if the threshold is lowered?
Yeah. So I'll start with the tax credit. It is designed for that purpose, right? So it's designed to help mitigate, right, the impact of that if, there is a decision there. Farmers are impacted by lots of changes, right? We have programs in there dealing with climate change, right, how it impacts them. There are new environmental rules, legislation, right, that impact farmers. And we want to make sure that we have, right, farmers in New York State, a local food supply, right, particularly when you have supply chain issues, as we have seen. So it's important to invest in our farmers and make sure, while the governor wants to do, right, the right thing with regards to the workers, also making sure that we can mitigate the impacts on the farmers themselves. So that is what that tax credit is for. And with regard to Build Back Better, I think we were all really looking forward to a lot of the investments in Build Back Better. And I don't have a crystal ball as to what's going to happen in Washington, but it would be very good for New York, right? And it hits on a lot of the things that the governor made investments on. She did not make investments, right, waiting for Build Back Better, because we have to move forward, right, notwithstanding what's going on in Washington. But there are a lot of investments in Build Back Better that would, be very important for New Yorkers. So we're hopeful, right, that they find the path forward there.
Robert, what are the state revenue projections for legalized marijuana? That's been something that's been slow just to get started, but there's some language in there about licensing fees. So what year are we going to see that revenue, and then when does it come to full fruition?
We expect licensing fees to come in 23, and we also expect some sales in 23. So, but the license fees, we expect them all to come in 23, but very not much on the revenue side in 23. Most of that's kind of in the out years, right? The governor was, very focused. It's one of the first things that she did when she came into office, right, is appoint the board and get them started. We've been actively funding them. They're making strides and moving forward, and we do expect licensing fees to come in this year.
Calendar or fiscal?
And yeah, we expect some sales at the end. Yeah.
And I just have one more question. Eric Adams this morning said that his team talked to Hochul's team about just some budget priorities. He didn't really get into anything. But in here, there's an extension of mayoral control. So what went into that? And then also there's more money for per pupil spending on charter schools. It's going to increase something like 4.7% per pupil. But there's no raising of the cap for New York City charter schools. Why wasn't the cap raised? And then also what went into adding more money for people in charter schools?
So it's not an increase, there's a formula for charter school tuition. And the formula is driven by two factors mainly. It's an increase overall in spending that's tied to the spending for district schools. So as district school spending goes up, so does charter school per pupil spending. It's on a lag, a multi-year lag. So they were lagged from last